Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for just a moment and picture this. You are a merchant captain. Your ship is a modest thing by the standards of the galaxy, a mid-range bulk freighter with a crew of 1,200 souls, engineers, ratings, navigators, astropaths, gunnery teams, household servants, even a few children born aboard in the deep corridors where families have lived for generations without ever once touching a planet's soil. You have cargo in the hold, maybe grain or manufactured parts, or processed ore from a system with a name nobody outside its own sector would recognize. You have orders, signed and sealed by some minor lord in some minor administratum office, with an itinerary that will take you across a handful of light years and deliver you, within a reasonable margin of error, to a destination that is already awaiting your arrival. You give the order to translate. Your navigator, that strange and quietly uncanny figure you try not to think too hard about, he opens the third eye beneath her linen head wrap and stares into a direction that has no name in the physical world. Your warp drive tears a seam in the fabric of reality. The stars outside your viewport go strange, and then they go wrong, and then they disappear entirely as your ship slides sideways out of the universe you have always known and into the place that exists beneath it. You expect to be in transit for a few weeks. Your crew settles into the rhythms of the journey. Shen the cook continues making meals, the engineers continue monitoring the Geller field, the chaplain continues his rounds, because in the warp, the devotional prayers matter more than anywhere else in the entire universe. The children in the lower decks play the games that children play when they have nowhere else to go. You check your charts, you review the supply manifests, you do the ordinary grinding work of running a ship, and then something changes. Maybe a current catches you, maybe a storm that you couldn't see coming swallows your vessel whole. Maybe the tides of that impossible place shift in ways that no navigator, no matter how skilled or how many centuries of breeding her family has put into her gifts, could possibly anticipate or navigate. The Astronomicon, that blazing psychic lighthouse burning on distant Terra, is powered by the slow sacrifice of 10,000 psychers who die at their posts so that ships like yours can find their way, goes strange, distant. Then it simply isn't there at all, swallowed by something deeper and darker in the currents you're riding. And time stops meaning what you thought it meant. This is the moment that everything the warp is becomes clear, not as a concept, but as a physical reality pressing against the hull. The warp does not experience time the way living things experience time. It does not feel the passage of moments from one to the next, building a sequence of cause and effect. It exists in a state that our brains simply were not designed to model. A state where all of its moments are simultaneously present, where what we call now and what we call then are not separated by duration, but merely by the angle at which consciousness chooses to look. From inside the ship, as with its mechanical chronometers and its biological rhythms and its careful daily routines, time feels like a river moving in one direction. From the perspective of the warp itself, that river has no banks, no source, no mouth, and no particular direction of flow. It is simply water everywhere at once. And the ship is a small, sealed container of the other kind of time, the kind with sequence and cause and forward motion. They're floating through a medium that finds those concepts not wrong exactly, but simply irrelevant. A week passes inside the ship. A decade passes outside. Another week. Another decade. The ratio compounds. The crew eats dinner on Tuesday and wakes up on Wednesday, and meanwhile a generation is born and grows old and dies somewhere on a world they have never visited, and the world's children have children. And the political regime under which all those children lived has collapsed and been replaced by something different. And the language spoken in the markets has shifted subtly away from the dialect in the ship's translation database, and a war has been fought and won or lost over territory whose significance the crew has no record of, and the war's consequences have shaped the architecture of 2 more decades of history. And still the ship is only on Thursday. When your ship finally punches back through into real space, when the stars return and the void outside the viewports becomes recognizable again, you check your instruments, you check your chronometers, you check the date. According to everything aboard your ship, you have been in transit for 6 weeks and 3 days. The crew is tired, the rations are somewhat depleted. The engineer's log notes a minor fluctuation in the port coolant system on day 20. The chaplain's records show that prayers were held every morning without interruption. 6 weeks. But outside your ship, waiting at the destination you were heading for, no one is waiting for you. No orbital approach controller hails your vessel. No tug comes out to guide you in. The orbital station that was there when you left is gone. The planet below looks different than the chart suggested. Older, more settled, or in some cases less settled. Cratered and scarred by conflicts you've never heard of. The Vox channels crackle with voices speaking a dialect of Gothic that has drifted far enough from what you know that you have to listen very carefully to understand them. And when you finally make contact, when some bewildered astro-telepathic relay or some shocked Navy picket vessel finally responds to your hails, the first thing they tell you sends a cold that has nothing to do with the void crawling through the metal walls of your ship. First they tell you what year it is, and the number they give you is not 6 weeks away from the number you left with. It is 10,000 years. Welcome to Warhammer 40,000, and welcome to one of the most haunting, most philosophically staggering, most genuinely terrifying corners of its already incomprehensibly dark lore. Tonight, we are going to sit with this question. We are going to pull it apart slowly, carefully, and deeply. But what actually happens when a ship emerges from the warp 10,000 years after it entered? Not just the practical mechanics, but the full weight of it, the cosmological horror of it, the human cost of it, the political and military implications of it, the way the Imperium responds to it, the way the crew experiences it, and the extraordinary real examples scattered throughout this lore that prove this is not a hypothetical. This has happened. In the galaxy of the 41st Millennium, as this continues to happen, the warp does not respect the assumptions you made when you left. So let's follow this thread all the way to the end, slowly and without rushing, because a story this strange and this vast deserves to be told the way it feels. Like something you are only barely beginning to understand, even as it opens up beneath you. Like the warp itself, dark and deep, and full of things that have been waiting a very long time. Check Part 2. Understanding the warp. The ocean beneath reality. Before we can truly grasp what it means for a ship to emerge 10,000 years out of time, we have to understand what the warp actually is. And I want to be careful here, because the warp is one of those lore concepts that is very easy to describe in summary and very difficult to actually comprehend in its full depth. It is easy to say, the warp is a parallel dimension of psychic energy, and move on. But that summary doesn't capture what the warp feels like as a place, what it does to things that enter it, or why time and space behave so fundamentally differently within it. The warp, also called the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, the Imperium, and 100 other names in 100 other languages spoken across 1 million worlds, is not a vacuum. It is not empty. It is, in the most literal sense the lore provides, the reflection of all conscious thought and emotion that has ever existed in the material universe, given form and substance and terrible, unsteady life. Every feeling ever felt by every sentient creature that has ever drawn breath. Every fear, every longing, every act of love or hatred or ambition or despair has poured into the warp across billions of years, and what has accumulated there is something that does not have an easy name in the language of science or reason. While the most basic way to picture it is as an ocean where the water is not water but raw, unfiltered emotion and thought given physical presence, where the currents are shaped not by gravitational forces or temperature differentials, but by the ebb and flow of feeling across entire civilizations, where a war that kills billions on a distant world sends shockwaves through these currents that can be felt light years away, where the emotional resonance of a species' greatest tragedy twists the tides for centuries. The Isle Dari's great hedonistic fall 10,000 years ago, an orgiastic collapse of an ancient civilization into extremes of pleasure and sensation so vast it physically tore a hole in reality, did not merely create a political problem. It carved the eye of terror into the galaxy's flesh, a wound in the barrier between the warp and real space that still bleeds today, and it birthed a chaos god in the process, Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, shaped from the accumulated psychic fallout of a civilization that had abandoned every restraint it had. The four great chaos gods, Horn the blood god, who is shaped from rage and martial violence, Tzeentch, the architect of fate, who is shaped from ambition and the desire for change, Nurgle the plague father, who is shaped from despair and the acceptance of decay, and Slaanesh, the prince of excess, who is shaped from desire in all its forms, are not merely powerful entities. They are expressions of what the warp has become after eons of being fed by mortal experience. They are the warp in some essential way. They are what happens when psychic energy concentrates, coalesces, and grows into something that possesses will, hunger, and the capacity to reach across the dimensional barrier and act. And understanding the chaos gods is important not just as background lore, but as direct context for temporal displacement, because each of them has a different relationship with time, and each of them has both motive and means to interfere with ships traveling through their domain. Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, is perhaps the most directly relevant to the 10,000-year displacement scenario. Tzeentch exists in a state of perpetual planning, perpetual scheming, our perpetual manipulation of probability and causality in ways that serve some incomprehensible long-term agenda, except that long-term, when applied to a being that exists outside normal time, is almost a contradiction in terms. Tzeentch does not plan ahead. Tzeentch plans sideways, diagonally, through dimensions of possibility that have no clean names, manipulating the temporal position of a single ship, plucking it from one moment in history, preserving it in the warp's currents, and releasing it at a different moment is the kind of small, precise, meaningful intervention that Tzeentch performs the way a chess player makes a calculated move, except that the board has an infinite number of dimensions and the game has been in progress since before the species playing it existed. Nurgle, too, has a peculiar relationship with time. The Plague Father exists in a state of paradox. He is associated with decay, with the slow grinding of entropy, but with the cycle of death and rot and renewal. And yet his domain is called the Garden of Nurgle, and it is in some sense a timeless place, a place where everything that has been diseased and corrupted and broken down is preserved in a state of eternal festering becoming. Things in Nurgle's domain do not die and disappear. They decay and remain. Ships that are claimed by Nurgle's attention do not vanish. They transform, slowly and comprehensively, into something that bears the marks of the process, while retaining enough structural integrity to continue in existence. A Nurgle-claimed ship emerging from the warp after a long displacement would be recognizable in outline as what it was, but the details would be wrong in ways that are biological rather than mechanical, organic rather than chemical, alive in ways that metal and circuitry are not supposed to be alive. And they are always there. When you enter the warp, you are entering their territory. But here is the aspect of the warp that matters most for our story tonight. Time inside the Imperium is not the same as time outside it. This is not a minor technical detail. It is the foundational, catastrophic fact around which everything else we are going to discuss is built. In real space, the ordinary universe of stars and planets and light years that you and I would recognize, time flows in a single direction at a consistent rate. An hour is an hour. Yes, a year is a year. The laws of physics enforce a kind of temporal contract on everything that exists. Cause precedes effect. Events happen in sequence, and if you leave a place and come back, roughly the same amount of time has passed for you and for the place you left. The warp does not honor this contract. Time in the warp is not a river. It is something more like a three-dimensional fog, where different parts of the fog are moving in different directions at different speeds. Some parts moving forward, some parts moving backward, some parts barely moving at all, and some parts spinning in loops that have no clean exit. The emotional and psychic energies that constitute the warp's substance do not experience duration the way physical matter does, because they are not physical matter. They exist in a state of perpetual, churning becoming, where what we would call past and future bleed into each other in ways that even the most learned psychers and navigators cannot fully map or predict. The Astronomicon, that psychic lighthouse burning on Terra that we mentioned earlier, powered by the continuous sacrifice of up to 1,000 psychers per day, and their lives burned up in service of projecting a signal that reaches perhaps 50,000 light-years across the galaxy, helps navigators maintain a sense of orientation in the warp. It gives them a fixed point, a direction, a reference against which they can attempt to hold their course. Without it, ships entering the warp are essentially sailing blind in a hurricane, while also unable to determine which direction is forward and which is down. The Astronomicon does not fix the time problem. It cannot, but it gives navigators enough of a handhold that, most of the time, most ships complete their journeys within a reasonable temporal margin of error. Most of the time. The standard rule of thumb that navigators and ship captains work with, found in the old Rogue Trader rulebooks and confirmed in various lore sources across the franchise, is that roughly 1 day experienced inside the warp corresponds to approximately 12 days passing in real space. A journey that feels like a week aboard ship might mean nearly 3 months have elapsed outside. This is already a profound strangeness, already a source of endless tragedy and isolation for those who travel the warp regularly, the voidfarers who come home to find their children older than they expected, the ship captains who return from a voyage to learn that the war they were sailing into is already over, won or lost without them. Spaces in the 40,000 universe are perpetual temporal immigrants, always slightly out of sync with the world they're supposed to belong to. But the 1:12 ratio is an average, and averages, in the warp, are suggestions rather than laws. In calm conditions, in well-charted regions close to the Astronomicon's strongest signal, on short hops along routes that generations of navigators have mapped and refined, the ratio can be much tighter. As a ship might spend 3 days in the warp and emerge to find only a few weeks have passed in real space. But in stormy conditions, in regions far from Terra where the Astronomicon's light fades and flickers, in uncharted space, near warp storms, or near the awful gravitational psychic pull of the Eye of Terror, or through any one of 1,000 other hazards and anomalies that the warp can produce, the ratio can stretch into something utterly incomprehensible. Ships have been recorded as spending what felt like a few hours in transit, only to emerge years later than expected. Others have spent what felt like years inside the warp, emerging only months after they left. The warp can compress time or expand it. It can loop it. There are even theological and cosmological arguments, whispered between scholars and psychers who have thought about this too long, but that the warp's relationship with time is not merely variable, but fundamentally non-linear. That somewhere in the deep currents of the Imperium, ships that have been lost are still traveling, and ships that have yet to set out are already arriving, and the tense in which any of this is happening is not a question the warp is capable of answering, because the warp does not experience tense. The warp experiences everything at once and nothing in particular. And it is this property, this impossible, disorienting, soul-destroying property, that creates the scenario we are examining tonight. A ship enters the warp and encounters conditions so extreme, or simply so strange, that the temporal gap between the ship's experience and the universe's experience grows not to weeks or months or years, but to centuries or millennia. The ship emerges, intact or nearly intact, with a crew who have lived 6 weeks or 6 months, and into a galaxy that has aged 10,000 years without them. The scale of that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Think of it this way. 10,000 years ago in our own actual history, the Bronze Age was ending. Writing was young. The great ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, they were either at their height or had not yet truly begun. Every single thing that has happened in human history since then, every empire, every war, every revolution, every discovery, every language ever spoken, every city ever built and destroyed, every name you have ever learned in a history class, all of it has unfolded within a 10,000-year window. And a ship emerging from the warp 10,000 years after it entered has missed all of that. Every single thing. The galaxy they returned to has the same relationship to the galaxy they left as our world today has to the world of the earliest human settlements. And in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, those 10,000 years have not been quiet. Part 3. The architecture of survival, warp drives, Geller fields, and the navigator's eye. To truly understand what it takes to survive inside the warp at all, let alone to survive it for a period of subjective weeks while objective millennia pass outside, we need to understand the machines and the people that make warp travel possible in the first place. Because here is the thing, a ship in the warp is not simply traveling fast. It is maintaining a bubble of reality inside a place that is actively trying to unmake everything inside it. The warp drive itself is the mechanism that allows a ship to enter and exit the warp. It works by generating an enormous surge of energy that tears a temporary hole in the fabric of the material universe, a process sometimes called translation, or a warp transition, or more colloquially, among crews, a jump. The physics of how this works are not cleanly explained in the lore, because the Imperium of the 41st Millennium operates not on scientific understanding, but on accumulated ritual and mechanical tradition, and the actual theoretical framework that would explain why a warp drive works was largely lost during the Age of Strife. Tech priests perform the activation sequences because they were taught to perform the activation sequences, not because they understand what the sequences are activating. This is one of the many tragedies of a civilization built on the worship of technology it no longer understands. The ship enters the warp at what is called a Mandeville point, the minimum safe distance from a massive body, like a planet or star, at which a warp translation can be attempted, without catastrophic gravitational interference, distorting the jump unpredictably. This is why warp travel is never instantaneous, even in the best of circumstances. A ship must travel at sublight speeds from its departure point to the edge of the system, then translate, then travel through the warp, then translate back out near the destination system's Mandeville point, and then travel sublight again to its actual destination. The total journey time, even for a fast warp transit, often spans months when all of this is accounted for. Once inside the warp, or the most critical system on the ship, the one that stands between the crew and annihilation, is the Geller field. The Geller field is a protective barrier, a bubble of real space projected around the ship's hull by a device that generates what can only be described as a zone of insistence, an area where the laws of the physical universe refuse to yield to the warp's attempts to override them. Within the Geller field, matter behaves like matter. Air remains air. Metal remains metal. Human beings remain human beings, with all the biological processes that entails. The ship's corridors maintain their dimensions. The laws of cause and effect continue to apply. Everything inside the bubble is, essentially, a small stolen pocket of the normal universe, being dragged through a place that is not normal and has never been normal. Outside the Geller field, beyond those thin metal hull plates, the warp does whatever the warp does, which is to say, everything and nothing, simultaneously. The entities that populate the warp, demons, predatory psychic constructs that are essentially concentrated emotional energy given purpose and hunger, press constantly against the field's boundary. They can feel the warmth of mortal souls inside it. The living crew, with their psychic residue and their constant mental activity, shine in the warp like candles in a dark room. The demons want what is inside that bubble. They push against it the way a hand pushes against a window pane, always testing for weaknesses, always looking for the flicker or the fluctuation that means a moment of vulnerability. And Geller fields do flicker. They do fluctuate. This is one of the most terrifying realities of warp travel, because the consequences of even a momentary failure are immediate and catastrophic. When a Geller field fails, even briefly, and even for a few seconds, the boundary between the ship and the warp ceases to exist. The warp pours in. The physical laws that hold the ship together, that hold the crew together, begin to dissolve. Demons manifest. Corridors that should be straight become labyrinthine. Crew members see things that should not be visible. They hear voices that are not voices. They feel their thoughts being read and reflected back at them in distorted forms. The weakest minds break first. But no mind is truly strong enough to witness what the warp is without some cost. Entire crews have been lost in Geller field failures, ships emerging from the warp empty of human life, but full of something else. Stained by psychic residue, marked by experiences that no living instrument can quite measure or record. Here is a detail that makes the Geller field even more unsettling. And that was confirmed in various Black Library novels and became increasingly prominent in the lore from the 3rd edition onwards. The primary component of a Geller field generator, the thing that actually produces the protective bubble of real space, is not a purely mechanical device. It is, in part, generated by the dreams of a psyker kept in a permanent, artificially induced coma. The psyker's consciousness, held in that twilight state between waking and sleeping, between the material and the immaterial, provides the psychic energy that makes the field coherent and stable. It is the human mind's innate sense of what is real. Its stubborn insistence that walls are walls and floors are floors and the laws of physics apply. That keeps the warp at bay. Which means the Geller field is literally a dream. The most important piece of survival equipment on any warp-capable ship is, at its core, the suspended dream of a comatose psyker who will eventually be consumed by the effort of maintaining it and need to be replaced. The psykers who serve as Geller field generators have, in many ships, a specific designation in the crew roster and a specific ritual status in the ship's religious practices. They are not quite crew and not quite cargo. They are more like living structural components, or treated with a mixture of reverence and pragmatic detachment that is deeply characteristic of the way the Imperium relates to the psykers it depends on. Their names are known. Prayers are said for them. Offerings are left outside the sealed chambers, where their motionless bodies are maintained in life-sustaining suspension. And when they burn out, when the effort of maintaining the dream that keeps the ship safe has depleted their psychic reserves beyond recovery, they are replaced with the same quiet efficiency that a damaged machine part is replaced. The old psyker is removed. A new one is installed. The dream continues without interruption. The new dreamer has no idea what the previous dreamer dreamed. They simply begin their own dream, and the field holds, and the ship continues through the dark. Whilst there is a philosophical weight to this, that the 40,000 universe rarely states directly, but that underlies so much of its texture, the Imperium's survival depends at every level on the consumption of individuals for the benefit of the collective. The psykers who die daily to power the Astronomicon. The soldiers who die daily in wars that never end. The workers who live short, difficult lives in the industrial hells of hive worlds and forge worlds. And now, how the dreamers who sleep their lives away inside the walls of ships so that everyone else on those ships can continue to exist. The Imperium is a civilization that runs on human sacrifice. Not always in the dramatic, ritualistic sense, though it certainly has that version too, but in the grinding, systematic, bureaucratic sense of lives consumed at scale in service of a machine too vast to function any other way. This is what every ship entering the warp is carrying in its walls. This is the secret behind the Geller field's stability. This is how the Imperium works. This is the machinery of survival in the 41st millennium. Barbaric, costly, deeply human in the worst possible ways, held together by sacrifice and will, and a level of pragmatic brutality that would be impossible to explain to someone who hadn't already lived it. Then there is the Navigator. The Navigator is arguably the most important individual on any warp-capable ship, and among the most important individuals in the entire Imperium of man. Navigators are a distinct human subspecies, the product of genetic engineering performed during the dark age of technology roughly 20,000 years before our story's present. They breed only within their own tight network of ancient noble houses, maintaining bloodlines that are among the oldest in human space, because their abilities cannot survive dilution. If a navigator has children with an ordinary human, the navigator gene is suppressed entirely in the offspring. The gift, as they call it, passes only through the purest lines. What the navigator gene gives them, manifested in the famous third eye on their foreheads, the warp eye, usually kept covered under cloth or leather except when actively needed, because its direct gaze can kill ordinary humans by exposing their minds to a moment of pure warp perception, is the ability to see the warp as it actually is. Not to go mad from it, not to be overwhelmed by it, but to perceive its currents and tides and navigate within them with something approaching skill. When a navigator opens their warp eye inside the warp, they see the Astronomicon burning across unimaginable distances, like a star that exists only in the psychic spectrum, and they use it as their reference point the way ancient sailors use the North Star. They read the currents around the ship, they direct the helm, they identify the paths of least resistance. They feel the edges of storms before the storms close in and chart the subtle channels through them. Without navigators, ships can only make short blind jumps of at most a few light years, calculated entirely from mathematical models built while still in real space, with no way to correct course once inside. These jumps are often wildly inaccurate, frequently arrive at the wrong destination, and have a substantially higher casualty rate than piloted jumps. The entire Imperium of man, a domain stretching across millions of worlds, maintained by endless supply chains and military deployments and communications networks, depends on navigators to function. If the Navis Nobile, the great collective of navigator houses, were to refuse service, the Imperium would fragment within a generation. This is why navigators, despite being technically human mutants in an empire that has historically treated mutants with everything from suspicion to violent persecution, are given a status and legal protection that almost nothing else in imperial society provides. But navigators, extraordinary as they are, have limits. The Astronomicon only reaches roughly 50,000 light-years from Terra. Beyond that distance, the signal fades beyond even a navigator's ability to perceive it. And the historical record is full of expeditions that pushed past the edge of the Astronomicon's range and simply never came back to report what they found. Even within range, warp storms can block or distort the signal. Even the most gifted navigator in the galaxy cannot perfectly predict or control the temporal displacement that occurs in the warp, because temporal displacement is not a navigational problem. It is a property of the warp itself. And no amount of skill or experience or ancient bloodline heritage changes that fundamental fact. All of which means that for a ship caught in extreme warp conditions, a major storm, an encounter with demons powerful enough to physically displace the vessel through the warp's currents, and the failure of the warp drive that leaves the ship drifting in the immaterium without directional control, the temporal displacement that results can reach scales that exceed anything practical. Experience has prepared the crew to understand. It is worth noting here that the Ordo Chronos, a minor but deeply intriguing branch of the Inquisition, dedicated specifically to investigating temporal anomalies connected to warp travel, has studied these displacement events more extensively than any other imperial institution. Their records, classified at the absolute highest levels of imperial secrecy, allegedly contain documentation of hundreds of vessels displaced by centuries and dozens displaced by millennia. The Ordo Chronos does not publish its findings. It does not share its models. But it maintains a strict information blackout around the subject, because the Inquisition, with characteristic institutional wisdom about human psychology, has determined that the widespread knowledge of exactly how catastrophically the warp can scramble time would be more destabilizing to imperial society than useful. What you do not know about the risks of warp travel, you cannot panic about. The Ordo Chronos is also, according to scattered references in the lore, at itself a casualty of temporal anomaly. At some point in imperial history, the Ordo, apparently sent expeditions to investigate specific temporal displacement events, and something went wrong with these expeditions in ways that the remaining fragmentary records refuse to clearly describe. And some sources suggest that the Ordo Chronos retroactively erased its own agents from the timeline, that their attempts to investigate temporal events placed them within those events in ways that caused them to be absorbed by the very phenomena they were studying. Other sources suggest something simpler and more terrible, that the agents simply followed the displaced ships into the conditions that displaced them and were themselves displaced, and are still out there somewhere in the folds of the warp, moving through subjective time at a rate that bears no relationship to the present moment. What is confirmed is that the Ordo Chronos, whatever its current state, no longer operates openly. Its offices are officially designated as suspended pending review. The review has apparently been pending for a very long time. Now, the implication being left for the reader is that the study of temporal displacement in the warp is dangerous in a specific way that goes beyond physical danger. That looking too closely at how time works in the Imperium has a tendency to pull the observer into the problem. 10,000 years is possible, because the warp is not merely dangerous. It is genuinely alien to the concept of time, in a way that even the smartest navigator or the most learned psyker cannot ultimately calculate or control. Part 4. Time as a river with no banks. The mechanics of temporal displacement. Let us spend some time with the mathematics and the mechanics of extreme temporal displacement in the warp, because this is where the real strangeness lives, and where the implications for our 10,000-year scenario become most concrete. The standard 1:12 ratio of warp time to real space-time is, as we noted, a rough average for calm conditions with a skilled navigator. It is already strange enough that the Imperium treats this as normal. In any other context, a transportation system that consistently delivers travelers 12 times further into the future than they subjectively experience would be considered a cosmic catastrophe. In the 41st millennium, it is considered an acceptable operational parameter, where the Imperium has built its entire interstellar economy and military logistics around it. Recruitment cycles for the Imperial Guard account for the fact that soldiers sent on a campaign might return to find years have passed at home. Families of voidfarers accept as a condition of their lives that relatives who go out on long voyages will return older or younger than expected. It is a wound that the entire civilization of the Imperium has simply learned to live with. But let's think about the physics of this more carefully, because understanding why the standard ratio exists helps us understand how it can become catastrophically larger. The 1:12 ratio exists, according to the various Rogue Trader and Dark Heresy RPG sourcebooks that discuss it in detail, primarily because the warp in calm conditions experiences time at a slower rate than real space. The currents of psychic energy in the Immaterium, flowing and cycling through their ancient patterns, simply move through their own experience of duration more slowly than physical matter moves through real space-time. A navigator skilled enough to identify and ride the faster-moving currents, the places where the warp's own internal temporal pace aligns most closely with real space, can reduce this ratio considerably, arriving closer to the intended time. A navigator working under poor conditions, or navigating a long journey through turbulent regions, will see the ratio grow. Warp storms, souse the dramatic meteorological events of the Immaterium that can last for decades or centuries in real space terms, are one of the primary drivers of extreme temporal displacement. A warp storm is not merely a hazard to navigation in the mechanical sense, not merely a region where the currents are stronger or more chaotic. It is a place where the warp's fundamental relationship with time has become distorted by whatever massive psychic event generated the storm in the first place. The emotional resonance of some catastrophic war, some great massacre, some terrible ritual or psychic detonation has altered the temporal landscape of the warp in that region in ways that can persist long after the physical events that caused them.
Okay, I just want to step out the lore for a second here and be real with you, because this is honestly one of the things that got me into 40k in the first place. What I love about this setting, and I mean genuinely love, not just it's cool or love, is that it never lets you feel comfortable. Like, the Imperium is supposed to be the good guys. They're humanity's last line of defense. And then you peel back one layer and find something like this, and you realize the whole thing is built on a foundation of quietly accepted horror that nobody talks about out loud. That tension is what keeps me coming back, not the vultures and not the battles. It's the moments where the lore just makes you sit with something deeply uncomfortable and goes, yeah, that's just how it is here. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
A ship caught in a warp storm does not simply travel off course. It travels off time. The storm's temporal distortions can accelerate the ratio far beyond 1 to 12, far beyond 1 to 100, far beyond anything that pre-mission briefings would have covered as a contingency. There are documented cases in the lore, recorded in the annals of fleet operations, in inquisitorial files, in the scattered private records of rogue traders, and in the oral traditions of navigator houses, of ships experiencing just a few weeks inside a severe warp storm while decades or centuries passed in the outside universe. The worst cases, the ones that become legends rather than mere incident reports, involve ships emerging from the warp with temporal gaps measured in millennia. Here is what makes this even more philosophically disturbing. From the crew's perspective, nothing unusual may have happened. The ship entered the warp. The journey proceeded with the normal anxieties and rituals and tribulations of warp travel. The navigator tracked the Astronomicon as best she could. The Gellerfield held against the pressing entities outside. The chaplain led prayers. The cook served meals. And then, after an appropriate subjective time, the ship emerged. The instruments said they were where they were supposed to be. The chronometers said the journey had taken the expected amount of time. Nothing about the internal experience of the voyage told the crew that anything was catastrophically wrong. It is only when they look out and check the external universe, the positions of stars, the calendar dates on incoming hails, the condition of familiar orbital installations, as the faces of people they expected to recognize, that the truth arrives. This has particular implications for our scenario of 10,000 years. A ship making a 10,000-year temporal displacement would most likely have experienced either a catastrophically severe warp storm that lasted for the entire duration of the subjective voyage, or a series of smaller temporal distortions compounding on each other in ways the navigator couldn't detect or correct. Or, in the most extreme and most disturbing interpretation, a deliberate intervention by one of the chaos gods, for whom temporal manipulation is simply a tool of play. Tzeentch, in particular, the changer of ways, delights in temporal paradoxes. There are hints in the lore that some lost ships are not accidents at all, but specifically taken, plucked from time and stored, preserved, and released at a moment of the architect of fate's choosing, decades or centuries or millennia out of place. But let's set aside the question of divine interference for a moment and focus on the mechanical reality of what a ship experiences when it has been in the warp for what its internal records say was a normal voyage. Inside the ship, during those 6 weeks or 6 months of subjective time, the crew has been living their lives. This is crucial. They have been eating and sleeping and arguing with each other and doing their jobs. The navigator has been monitoring the Astronomicon with increasing difficulty as the storm around them grew worse, or perhaps she tracked it perfectly fine and simply had no way of knowing the temporal distortions were occurring at all. The psychers on board may have felt something wrong in the warp around them, an unusual intensity to the pressure against the Geller field, and a quality to the chaos outside that didn't quite match their experience of typical storms. But there is no instrument that directly measures temporal displacement from inside the warp. There is no alarm that goes off when the ratio shifts from 1 to 12 to 1 to 100,000. The crew simply lives their 6 weeks, and the universe outside lives its 10,000 years, and neither side of this equation knows about the other until the moment of emergence. And the moment of emergence, we should understand, is not like flipping a switch. Translation back into real space is a process. The warp drive generates another transition event. Reality tears in reverse, and the ship is expelled from the Imperium back into physical space. This process takes hours, sometimes half a day, and during it, the crew is in a peculiar liminal state, partly in the warp, partly in real space, aware of both, but fully in neither. This is always disorienting. Even for experienced warp travelers, at the moment of translation back into real space involves a period of sensory confusion, of the mind struggling to reconcile the chaotic perceptions of the warp with the rational inputs of the physical universe. There are reports in various novels and sourcebooks of warp frost during these transitions, a physical phenomenon where the temperature aboard ship drops dramatically as the real space environment reasserts itself, sometimes leaving ice on the walls, frost in the corridors, and a coldness in the metal that takes hours to fade. For a ship returning after 10,000 years, the physical translation is presumably identical to any other emergence. The frost, the disorientation, the gradual reassertion of real space clarity as the warp's influence recedes. What would be different is what the sensors show when they begin functioning clearly again. The stars outside would be subtly wrong. Not dramatically, not in ways that would necessarily be visible to the naked eye, but in the precise catalogue positions that astronomical instruments would detect, there would be drift. Stars move over 10,000 years. The positions in the ship's charts that were accurate when the ship entered the warp, would no longer precisely match the stars they show. This would register as a navigation anomaly, something the instruments flag as an inconsistency, and something the navigator would notice as a dissonance between the Astronomican's current signal and its expected character. And then, the external communications would begin to come in, if there are any. Part 5. What it was like aboard. Life, fear, and the long hours of the deep warp. Before we get to the moment of arrival and all the horror it brings, let's slow down and spend some time inside the ship itself. It's because there's a human story here that the grand cosmological scale can overshadow, and it deserves attention. These weren't machines that got lost. These were people. A large Imperial void ship typically carries a crew measured in thousands, not hundreds, thousands. A standard battlecruiser might have anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 souls aboard. A grand cruiser or a battle barge can carry tens of thousands. Even a modestly sized merchant freighter, a mid-range cargo hauler of the kind that the average citizen of the Imperium would be more likely to interact with than any military vessel, carries a crew of several thousand. These are not small communities. They are cities unto themselves, metal cities that happen to move through space, with all the social complexity that implies. The hierarchy aboard an Imperial ship is strict and ancient, stratified in ways that reflect the Imperium's broader social architecture. At the top, as the captain, almost certainly someone of noble birth, or at least of a family with long void-faring traditions, because the Imperium does not casually hand command of expensive star-traveling vessels to people without pedigree. Below the captain, an extensive officer class of navigational experts, gunnery officers, engineering chiefs, and household functionaries. Then the non-commissioned ratings, yet the skilled workers who keep the ship's systems running, the machinists and the void riggers, and the sensor technicians and the medical staff. Then the lower ratings, the unskilled labor that is in many ways indistinguishable from servitude, men and women born aboard the ship or pressed into service who perform the physically demanding, often dangerous maintenance tasks in the deepest corridors and the lowest decks. Some of these people, and their families, have never left the ship. And they were born aboard, they will live their entire lives aboard, and they will die aboard, never once having stood on the soil of any world, never having seen a sky that wasn't a painted mural. This last group is worth pausing on, because they represent something particular about long warp voyages. In the generations of a ship's operation, entire micro-civilizations develop in the lower decks. These are communities with their own traditions, their own dialects of ship cant that have drifted from standard Imperial Gothic, their own religious practices that layer over the official Imperial cult, but add local color and local superstition and local ritual that hasn't appeared in any official Ministorum prayer book. They worship the Emperor, yes, this is universal, This is the one unifying thread of Imperial culture. But they worship him in ways that are specific to their ship and their circumstances, adding prayers for safe passage, as rituals to appease the machine spirits of the vessel, traditions around the sounds the ship makes in different regions of the warp, and deeply personal theologies around what happens to the soul when the Geller field flickers and the warp intrudes. These people know the warp not as an abstract cosmological concept, but as the constant, pressing reality outside the walls. They grow up hearing it. They grow up feeling it. The older hands in the lower decks can tell, or by subtle changes in the sound profile of the hull and the behavior of the lighting and the quality of their own dreams, whether the warp is calm or turbulent around them. This is folk knowledge, accumulated over generations of shipboard life, and it is not entirely unreliable. The deep sensitivity to the warp environment that long-term voidfarers develop is real enough that navigators sometimes consult with the oldest lower-deck crews about the feel of a particular region of the Imperium, or because those crews have crossed it hundreds of times in their family histories, and their accumulated wisdom is a form of data. During a normal warp transit, life aboard continues with the rhythms that have been established over generations. The ship has shift cycles, typically a standard day divided into watches, with crews rotating through active duty and rest periods. Meals are served at regular intervals, tracked by internal chronometers rather than any external cycle. Because in the warp there is no sun to set, no natural rhythm of light and dark to anchor biological time. The ship creates its own time. The clocks on the wall are the only clocks that matter, and they are maintained with a religious devotion, because time discipline is a form of sanity maintenance in the warp. Keeping the schedule means keeping the self. There is a particular kind of person who becomes a voidfarer, and it is useful to understand what that person is. They are not, in general, us adventurers or thrill seekers or people who embrace the strangeness of space travel as something wonderful. The void of the 40,000 universe is not romantic. It is cold and dangerous and profoundly inhospitable, and the people who travel it regularly are, in the main, people for whom the alternative, life on a planet somewhere, is either unavailable or simply not what their lives have been shaped toward. Many voidfarers have never known anything else. They were born aboard. Their parents were born aboard. Their identity is bound up not with any planetary culture or regional identity, but with the ship itself and the community that ship contains. This creates a particular kind of loyalty and a particular kind of psychology. The ship is home in a way that nothing else can be. It is not a vehicle that transports you somewhere. It is somewhere. The deck beneath your feet, the specific quality of the recycled air, the sounds the hull makes in different warp conditions, or the particular way the artificial gravity settles in your joints after a translation. These are the textures of home, and the people aboard are not colleagues or crewmates in the way that term suggests a professional relationship that could be exchanged for another set of colleagues. They are family, in the deepest sense, people whose lives are interwoven with yours in ways that cannot be easily separated. This social density is both a resource and a vulnerability when things go wrong. Whereas the cohesion of a well-functioning ship's crew is genuinely one of its primary defensive assets in the warp. A community that trusts each other, that has established rituals and social contracts and ways of managing conflict, is dramatically harder to crack with the warp's psychological pressure than a collection of isolated individuals, each dealing with the stress of the transit alone. But when cohesion breaks down, when the warp's influence finds the fracture lines in a crew's social fabric and begins to widen them, through paranoia, through bad dreams, through the subtle cultivation of old resentments into new suspicions, the collapse can be catastrophic precisely because everyone is so close. The chaplains aboard, both the official priests of the Imperial cult and the informal spiritual advisors in the lower decks, are busier in the warp than anywhere else. Prayer services, blessings, the ritual anointing of critical systems with sanctified oils, the burning of incense to ward the machine spirits and keep the darkness beyond the hull from finding gaps in our faith. These are not purely metaphorical actions. In the warp, where psychic energy is ambient and real, where the collective emotional state of the crew can actually influence the stability of the Geller field in subtle ways. Genuine faith has genuine protective value. A crew that prays together, that reinforces its own cohesion through shared ritual, is marginally but measurably harder to crack than a crew fragmented by fear and doubt. But sustained warp transit still takes a toll. The human brain is not designed for the warp. It is designed for real space, for a universe that obeys rules it can learn and predict. The warp, even with a functioning Geller field keeping the worst of it at bay, leaks its wrongness into the sensorium in subtle ways. But the light in the warp has a quality to it that it doesn't have in real space. Something that people who have traveled extensively through the Imperium describe as a faint but persistent wrongness, like a color that shouldn't exist, has been mixed into the air. Dreams aboard ship in the warp are reliably stranger and more disturbing than dreams in real space. People who are sensitive, the psychers, certainly, but also people who simply have a slight natural psychic sensitivity that has never been formally identified, sometimes hear things or see things at the edges of their vision that they would rather not have seen. Anxiety is a constant background note. The Geller field holds, and the ship moves through its daily rhythms. But everyone aboard knows, in a way that their body knows even when their mind is trying not to acknowledge it, that the only thing standing between them and annihilation is a dream, being dreamed by a comatose psyker in a sealed room somewhere deep in the ship's engineering section, and that dream can end at any moment. Sleep is difficult for many crew members in the warp. There's a documented phenomenon in the lore called warp sickness, which manifests differently in different people, but typically involves a deterioration of mental stability over extended warp travel, paranoia, erratic behavior, difficulties distinguishing memory from hallucination, a blurring of the line between dreaming and waking. Long voyages see a measurable increase in interpersonal conflicts, in paranoid episodes, in strange cults or panic movements forming in isolated corners of the lower decks. Commanders of warp-going vessels develop a keen eye for the early signs of warp sickness and learn to manage it through a combination of structured routine, pastoral attention from chaplains and medical staff, and where necessary, more forceful intervention. For children born aboard the ship, those lower deck families who have never known any reality other than the metal corridors and the ambient strangeness of the warp, the experience is different in interesting ways. While they do not have a baseline of normal to compare the warp against, the subtle wrongness that unsettles adult crew members who grew up on planets is simply the world to them. The sounds the hull makes in turbulent warp conditions, the quality of the light, the intensity of their dreams, these are just the textures of existence. Yet there is some evidence in the broader lore that people raised primarily in the warp develop a kind of resilience to warp sickness that their planet-born counterparts lack, along with a certain psychic background sensitivity that is not quite mutant potential, but is more than ordinary. Now imagine this crew, these thousands of human lives, but with all of their complexity and their relationships and their dreams and their fears, spending 6 weeks in the warp on what they believe is a routine voyage. The journey has had its tribulations. Perhaps the storm got a little rough in the second week, and the Geller field flickered once, just once, enough to send a cold wave of genuine terror through every soul aboard before the field stabilized and the chaplains called for emergency prayer services that lasted for 6 straight hours. And perhaps the navigator has been quieter than usual in the last few days of the voyage, staring into her instruments with an expression nobody on the bridge could quite read. Perhaps there was a brief incident in the lower decks where 3 crew members experienced simultaneous vivid hallucinations that they described as voices from outside the hull asking to be let in, and were taken to the medical bay and sedated. Nothing unusual by warp travel standards. Nothing that the captain would feel the need to log as a serious incident. 6 weeks, and then the navigator announces the approach to their exit point. The warp drive winds up for translation. The frost forms on the walls. The stars come back. And nothing is where it should be. Not in the ways that matter most. Part 6. the moment of emergence, crossing back into a world that has moved on. The moment a ship translates back into real space from the warp is, in practice, a complicated and multi-stage process that the crew has performed dozens or hundreds of times. There is an established protocol. The navigator signals the approach to the intended exit point. The engineering section charges the warp drive for translation. Crew members are required to be in secured positions because translation involves physical vibrations and sudden changes in pressure that have been known to injure people caught in the wrong place. The chaplains lead a final prayer before translation, a tradition so old and so universal that even entirely irreligious crews tend to observe it, because crossing the threshold between the warp and real space is precisely the sort of moment where nobody wants to be the person who skipped the prayer. Then the transition happens. The warp drive fires. Reality tears and heals in reverse. The ship is expelled back into the physical universe with a lurch that the crew feels in their bones, even through the inertia dampeners, a kind of cosmic hiccup where the universe acknowledges their return with a brief period of profound instability. For a few seconds or a few minutes, the ship is in both states simultaneously, partly still in the warp, partly in real space, the boundaries of both realities pressing against each other with the vessel caught in between. During this window, people sometimes see things. The boundary between the immaterium and real space is at its thinnest, and psychically sensitive crew members have reported experiences during this period that they cannot articulate in normal language, a sense of vast time, of layers of history compressed into a single moment of perception, of the ship's position in temporal as well as physical space becoming briefly, overwhelmingly apparent. As most people experience this as nothing more than a wave of nausea or a brief visual distortion, an afterimage of the warp's wrongness lingering in the sensory field as the transition completes. But for a ship that has undergone extreme temporal displacement, there are accounts of the translation moment being noticeably stranger than usual, as if the size of the temporal gap creates a proportionally larger seam to stitch back together. Then the transition completes. The warp is gone. So the stars are real again. The ship's sensors, which work very differently in real space than in the warp, come back online with full functionality and begin feeding data to the bridge. And here is where the first strange notes begin. The navigator, who has been staring through her warp eye at the Astronomicon for the entire voyage, now closes her third eye and switches to standard navigation instruments. She begins correlating their exit position with the stellar charts. The charts are the ship's original charts, the ones drawn up before departure, accurate at the time of entering the warp. And something is slightly off. The star positions are close. They are recognizable, but they have drifted. Stars drift on timescales of thousands of years, their positions shifting slightly as the galaxy rotates and as their own proper motion carries them through space. But the discrepancy between the charts and the actual star positions is subtle enough that it wouldn't register as anything more than a possible chart error or navigation drift, except that the magnitude of the discrepancy is slightly wrong for the journey length. The navigator notices this. She says nothing yet. She runs the calculation twice, then a third time. Meanwhile, the communications officer begins attempting to raise the destination system. Standard hailing frequencies formed the identification codes that the ship's departure port provided, the recognition signals that would identify them to the local orbital control as a vessel with legitimate transit authority. In normal circumstances, the response comes within minutes. Even in busy systems where traffic is heavy, even in systems where the communication infrastructure is not perfectly maintained, a signal from an arriving vessel gets a response in minutes to hours. The communications officer waits, tries alternate frequencies, tries old frequencies, backup frequencies. The silence stretches. Then something comes back. Not from the expected destination, from a picket vessel, some small Imperial warship maintaining a patrol orbit of the outer system. The signal is automated at first, a challenge code, the standard Imperial Navy request for identification. The communications officer replies with the ship's identification, name, registry, authority, point of departure, destination, It had expected arrival. The response from the picket vessel takes longer than it should. When it finally comes, it is not the automated acknowledgement of a routine arrival. It is a live voice, and the live voice sounds confused. Vessel, can you repeat your registry designation? We're showing that identification number as a pause, a longer pause. Voices in the background that the ship's receivers can barely make out. Then, please stand by. Please hold your current position and do not approach. We are contacting higher authority. The captain of the arriving vessel, standing on the bridge and watching the communications officer's face as this exchange unfolds, begins to feel the first cold fingers of something very wrong reaching for the back of his neck. Because why would a standard arrival registration prompt the picket vessel to contact higher authority? Why would a ship appearing at a transit point generate anything other than a routine arrival stamp? What does it mean that the picket vessel hesitated before saying, "We're showing that identification number as," and then didn't finish the sentence? More signals come in. The navigation data updates as the ship's sensors gather more information about the surrounding space. And now the inconsistencies pile up faster than anyone can comfortably process. The orbital installation that should be visible at the planet's L4 point is gone. Not derelict, not dark, but gone entirely. And in its place, there is something different, something larger and more complex in architecture that matches none of the charts. The planet itself is there, but its atmospheric readings have changed. The ice coverage of one of its moons is different from what the charts show. And when the ship's historical databanks are queried, when the navigator inputs the current stellar positions and asks for a calculated date based on stellar drift since the last known accurate fix, and the number the computer returns is not 6 weeks after the date of departure. The number the computer returns is 10,000 years after the date of departure. The bridge falls quiet in a way that has no name. There are no words from any training, any preparation, any mental model of what warp travel can do that apply directly to this moment. The officers look at each other. The captain looks at the number. The navigator, whilst with her third eye now covered and her face carefully composed into something that could generously be called professional neutrality, says nothing for a very long time. It is often the smallest, most practical concerns that break the silence in moments like this. What do you say first when you discover your ship has skipped 10,000 years? In at least one recorded account of temporal displacement, yet the first words spoken after the realization was confirmed were, "Does this mean we're late for the delivery or early?" The black humor of the void. It persists even in the presence of impossible facts. Eventually, the full picture assembles itself. The system around them is not what the charts showed. The civilization of the world below is not what it was when they left. The picket vessel, which has by now received instructions from its own command chain and is communicating with the arriving ship through channels that have clearly been elevated to some significant level of urgency, confirms the date, and confirms it again when asked, and again. The crew of the ship, all 1,200 souls, have lived 6 weeks. The universe has lived 10,000 years. Part 7. A galaxy unrecognizable, what 10,000 years of history has done. Now we need to talk about what 10,000 years actually means in the context of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Because it is not like the 10,000 years of our own history. The Warhammer galaxy has changed in ways that are genuinely, foundationally different from the state it was in when the ship left. If a ship departed in the late 30th millennium, say during the Great Crusade, yet that era of extraordinary optimism when the Emperor of Mankind and his 20 genetic sons, the Primarchs, were leading the greatest military expansion in human history and emerged in the current era of the 41st millennium, they would be returning to a galaxy that has undergone transformations so profound that the word change barely contains them. When they left, the Imperium of man was still being built. The Great Crusade was reuniting human colony worlds across the galaxy, bringing them back into contact with Terra and with each other. rebuilding the interstellar networks of trade and culture and governance that the terrible age of strife had destroyed over the preceding millennia. The Emperor walked among his people. The Primarchs commanded their Space Marine legions in person. The future, however challenging, felt like it was pointing toward expansion, toward the consolidation of a human civilization that might, against all odds, endure and grow. But the Horus Heresy had not yet happened. This is the detail that makes the 10,000-year displacement from the era of the Great Crusade to the 41st millennium the most particular form of horror. Because the Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning civil war in which fully half of the Space Marine legions turned traitor and nearly destroyed everything humanity had built, did not happen to people who knew it was coming. It happened to people who thought the worst was behind them, but in the crew of a ship that departed in the confident era of the Great Crusade did not know that within a generation of their departure, Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the Emperor's most beloved son, would be corrupted by the Chaos Gods and lead 9 legions in a war against the Emperor himself. They did not know that the Siege of Terror would kill trillions. But they did not know that the Emperor would be mortally wounded and installed on the Golden Throne, that device of last resort that keeps his shattered body alive through the sacrifice of thousands of psykers every day, where he has sat for 10,000 years, neither truly living nor truly dead. A corpse that is not allowed to stop existing, because the moment it does, the warp overwhelms the galaxy and everything is over. They left in a time when the Emperor was a living man, bestriding the halls of his palace and directing the destiny of humanity with his own voice. They return to find a galaxy where that same Emperor has been a withered god corpse on a throne for 10,000 years, and where his empire has taken the fact of his undeath and built a religious civilization of staggering scale and ferocity around it. Or the Imperium of the 41st millennium does not merely acknowledge the Emperor, it worships him with a devotion and a violence that would have horrified many citizens of the 30th millennium. The ecclesiarchy, the state church of the Imperium, controls trillions of souls. The Inquisition hunts heretics and mutants and psykers with methods that the early Imperium, with its relatively more liberal approach to diversity and its explicit rejection of religion as state doctrine, would have found barbaric. The returning crew would find an Imperium that looks like the one they left, the way a person in extreme old age looks like they did in childhood, recognizable in certain fundamental ways, certain structural echoes, certain preserved features, but transformed by time and hardship and the accumulation of wounds into something that has a completely different relationship with the world. But beyond the Imperium itself, the galaxy has changed in other ways that would be immediately visible and viscerally disturbing. The Eye of Terror, already present when the ship left as a disturbing region of space where chaos corruption bled into reality, has grown. 10,000 years of chaos activity, 10,000 years of the traitor legions raiding out from their fortress domains within that psychic wound in the galaxy's flesh, have made it larger and more deeply embedded in the fabric of real space. And in the very recent period of the 41st millennium, something even worse has occurred. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, has torn itself across the entire width of the galaxy, a wound in reality stretching from one side to the other, splitting the Imperium into 2 halves with a river of warp energy that makes travel between them enormously more dangerous and communication between them nearly impossible. This event happened recently enough in galactic terms, that a ship returning from 10,000 years in the warp might arrive to find the galaxy mid-cataclysm. The Tyranids have arrived. When the ship left, the Tyranid hive fleets were still in the intergalactic void, still hundreds of thousands of light years away, still utterly unknown to any human civilization. Now, they are here, consuming world after world in the eastern reaches of the galaxy, and organisms from beyond the stars, so alien in their biology and their psychology that the warp itself recoils from them. The shadow in the warp, the psychic phenomenon that the leading edges of hive fleets produce, a deadening of the psychic environment that silences the Astronomicon and cuts off astropathic communication and makes navigators nearly useless, is a reality of the current era that no ship from 10,000 years ago could have any context for. The Tau Empire, small but potent, thus exists in the eastern fringe. When the ship left, the Tau had not yet developed warp-capable starships. They were a species still confined to a relatively small region of space. Interesting, but not yet a significant galactic power. Now they have had 10,000 years of technological and cultural development, and while they remain a smaller power compared to the Imperium or the ancient races, they are a real presence with their own fleets and their own philosophy. The Necrons, who were in the process of awakening from their 60 million year tombs when the ship left, have continued their awakening. Ancient mechanical beings who predate all of current galactic civilization, who sold their organic bodies for immortal metal frames in exchange for the power to challenge gods, are stirring across thousands of tomb worlds. Many of their rulers have been active for long enough to have begun reasserting their ancient territorial claims. And the Imperium has fought them in countless bitter wars that the crew of the returning ship has never heard of. None of this is in the ship's databanks. None of this is in any reference the crew can access aboard. The history they know ends at the moment they entered the warp, and everything since then, 10,000 years of war and politics and horror and transformation, is unknown to them. They are, in the most literal possible sense, strangers in their own civilization. And they are carrying information. They carry first-hand accounts of the world as it was, living witnesses to a time that is now so remote it has become legend, mythology, religious text distorted beyond recognition by 10,000 years of institutional manipulation. They know things that the Imperium of the 41st Millennium has either lost or deliberately suppressed. They remember a galaxy where the Emperor was a living man and the Primarchs were living people. And the Great Crusade was a project of expansion rather than a distant founding myth. Their memories are historical documents. Their testimony is potentially explosive, and the Imperium of the 41st Millennium has very, very complicated feelings about explosive historical testimony. Consider what a returning crew member from the era of the Great Crusade would know about the Space Marine legions. They knew them as legions, not chapters. In the 30th millennium, the Space Marines were organized into 20 massive legions, each potentially hundreds of thousands strong, each controlled by one of the Emperor's Primarchs. The Lunar Wolves, the Ultramarines, the Word Bearers, the Iron Warriors, the Death Guard. These were not yet the distant mythological presences that the 41st millennium makes them. They were present, living institutions that ordinary citizens of the Imperium interacted with directly. They were the blunt instruments of the Great Crusade, just sweeping across the galaxy and bringing worlds into compliance, and the crews of support and logistics vessels would have had regular, direct contact with them. But in the 41st millennium, those legions do not exist in their original forms. The Horus heresy destroyed or fractured most of them. The 9 legions that sided with Horus, the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, the World Eaters, the Emperor's Children, the Word Bearers, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and the Alpha Legion retreated into the Eye of Terror after Horus's defeat and became the Traitor Legions, the main military forces of Chaos Space Marines. They are still there, still fighting, still raiding out from the Eye of Terror across 10,000 years, corrupted and mutated by millennia of exposure to chaos, but still driven by the terrible purposes they chose. The 9 remaining loyal legions were divided up after the heresy into the current chapter system. Hundreds of smaller organizations, each capped at 1,000 Space Marines by the Codex Astartes, the military treaties written by Robert Guilliman that reshaped the Astartes' place in Imperial society. A returning crew member who knew the Ultramarines Legion would find that the Ultramarines chapter still exists, but as one of hundreds of successor organizations, with perhaps 1,000 Marines, where once there were tens of thousands, and with the Primarch they remember as a living figure now in legend. Or actually, in this specific case, they would find Robert Guilliman himself, because one of the stranger features of the current 41st millennium's recent history is that Guilliman was placed in a stasis field after being mortally wounded at the end of the heresy, and lay preserved for 10,000 years until events surrounding Abaddon, the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade, and the machinations of Archmagos Belisarius Cawl resulted in his revival. Guilliman walks the galaxy again, serving as the Lord Commander of the Imperium. The returning crew member from the 30th Millennium and Guilliman would have something extraordinary in common. Both of them are out of time in their own ways, but both of them carrying a version of the galaxy as it was into a galaxy that has moved far beyond that version. This is, incidentally, a detail the lore only lightly explores, but that contains enormous narrative potential. The Primarchs who have returned, Guilliman, and more recently Magnus the Red and Mortarion for the Chaos side, are not simply powerful beings dropped into the current era. They are temporal anomalies, as beings who carry the assumptions and relationships and knowledge of a world that has not existed for 10,000 years, navigating a civilization that has grown up in their absence, and in many cases specifically around their absence. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium was shaped by the fact that the Primarchs were not there. It built its theologies and its politics and its command structures around that absence. Their return is not simply the return of powerful individuals. It is the return of context that the current era has been carefully managing its relationship with for 10 millennia. A returning crew from 10,000 years ago would be a smaller version of this same phenomenon. Not Primarchs, obviously. Not figures whose return reshapes galactic politics, but living voices from a lost age, whose simple act of describing what they remember challenges the official version of events in ways that the Imperium's institutional machinery will work as steadily and methodically to contain. None of this is in the ship's databanks. None of this is in any reference the crew can access aboard. The history they know ends at the moment they entered the warp, and everything since then, 10,000 years of war and politics and horror and transformation, is unknown to them. They are, in the most literal possible sense, strangers in their own civilization. Part 8. The Ghost Ships. What the crew finds. What finds the crew? Not all ships that spend extended time in the warp emerge intact. This is a reality we cannot avoid if we're going to be honest about what the warp does to things left inside it for long enough. The Geller field is extraordinary, and a well-maintained ship, crewed by trained and disciplined people, can survive remarkable periods of warp transit. But the warp is patient in a way that living things cannot be. And it is creative in a way that no system of defense can fully anticipate. Let's talk about the different states in which a long-displaced ship might emerge, because they range from profoundly disturbing but manageable to should immediately be destroyed, no questions asked. In the best case, the case we have been largely imagining for our scenario, the ship emerges essentially intact. The crew is physically unharmed, perhaps slightly stressed, slightly strange from weeks of warp exposure, but recognizably themselves. The Geller field held continuously throughout the transit. The navigator maintained orientation through the storm, without the ship being significantly battered by warp entities. The chaplains kept the crew's morale and faith stable. The machines maintained their function. This best case is genuinely achievable, and the lore gives us examples of ships and crews surviving improbably long warp transits in essentially good condition. But there are other cases. There is the case of the ship that emerges with parts of its crew changed, not dramatically corrupted in the obvious, visible mutations and glowing eyes and tentacles way that immediately triggers the Ordo Malleus's attention. Changed subtly. A section of the lower decks where everyone who lives there has been quietly, incrementally affected by long warp exposure in ways that haven't risen to the level of full chaos corruption, but have certainly moved them in a direction that no one who cared about these people's souls should be comfortable with. The warp's influence on the mind is not always a sudden catastrophic possession. Sometimes it is slow, sometimes it is quiet, sometimes it is the difference, over a few weeks of intensive exposure, between a person who was devout and loyal and ordinary, and a person who has started hearing whispers and finding the whispers reasonable. There is the case of the ship that emerges with sections of its interior physically altered. This is one of the most disturbing phenomena in warp travel lore, the mutation of the ship's structure itself. The warp is transformative in its fundamental nature, and a long enough exposure, especially if the Geller field was imperfect or intermittent, it can change the physical matter of a ship in ways that range from cosmetically strange to structurally catastrophic. Corridors that have changed shape, rooms that have become larger or smaller, or that are in different positions than the blueprints show. Material that used to be metal and is now something else, something that resists analysis and has a surface texture that no one who touches it wants to touch again. Hatches that open onto spaces that can't exist, or lights that cast shadows at the wrong angles. In extreme cases, the ship's interior has become a labyrinth with no reliable map, a structure that no longer obeys consistent geometry. Then there is the case of the ship that emerges with something extra aboard that wasn't there when it left. The warp is populated with entities that are always looking for opportunities, and a ship spending an extended period in the Imperium with any weakness in its defenses, any fluctuation in the Geller field, at any moment of doubt or despair in the crew strong enough to create a psychic opening, can become home to a stowaway from the other side. These stowaways range from minor warp entities, essentially ambient psychic irritants that manifest as bad luck and persistent bad dreams and small objects moving when they shouldn't, and all the way up to fully formed demons that have managed to embed themselves so deeply in the ship's systems that they have become genuinely difficult to detect and extraordinarily difficult to remove. The Imperial Inquisition has specific procedures for these scenarios. The Ordo Malleus, the demon hunters, maintain files on known patterns of demonic infestation and occupation, and when a long-displaced ship emerges, the standard protocol involves a thorough investigation of the vessel before any crew members are allowed to disembark, because a demon that has been quietly living inside a ship for even a few weeks of subjective time may have extended its influence into the crew in ways that look like ordinary post-warp stress from the outside. And then there is the worst case, the ship that emerges empty, or apparently empty. A ship that drifts out of the warp and into real space with no living crew, and no active life support, no communications, no response to hails. A ghost ship in the most literal possible sense, carrying only silence and the physical records of whatever happened aboard before the silence fell. The Navy maintains procedures for boarding such vessels. The boarding parties are always heavily armed and always include psychic support, because the silence might not mean the absence of presence. It might mean the presence of something that has no reason to speak. In the lore, the most developed category of ghost ship that has emerged from long warp displacement is the Space Hulk. Space Hulks are those famous megastructures of fused derelict ships that periodically emerge from the warp, often enormous enough to have their own internal gravity and atmosphere, carrying within them the accumulated debris of centuries or millennia of vessels lost in the immaterium colliding and merging in the formless space between material and warp. The Mortis Thule, one of the most famous and longest documented space hulks in Imperial records, has been sighted repeatedly over the course of the Imperium's history, appearing in the Jericho Reach with a regularity that suggests it follows some vast, slow circuit through the warp and real space, with its sightings dating back to the very earliest records of the age of technology. It carries within it, presumably, ships from that era, vessels that predate the Imperium by tens of thousands of years, are embedded in the Hulk's body, along with everything that lived and died aboard them. When a space Hulk emerges, it is not just the ships themselves that matter, it is what they might contain. The death of Integrity, one of the most significant space Hulk encounters documented in the official 40,000 lore, was boarded in 887 of the 39th Millennium by combined forces of the Blood Drinkers and Nova Marine's Space Marine chapters. It was infested with Tyranid Genestealers, as most space Hulks eventually become, those patient and horrifyingly successful infiltrator organisms that are the hive mind's advanced scouts. The battle to purge the Hulk was costly, but deep within the Hulk's composite structure, the boarding parties found something extraordinary. a standard template construct database, extraordinarily well preserved, containing data on lost technologies. At the value of this single find, this one item recovered from a ghost ship that had spent thousands of years being fused together in the warp, was significant enough that the Adeptus Mechanicus gifted both participating chapters with newly commissioned strike cruisers as payment. This is the lure that keeps the Imperium engaging with space hulks, despite the terrible cost of doing so. The lost ships within them carry the technology of ages that can no longer be replicated. We're at the dark age of technology, that golden era of human achievement that existed before the Age of Strife, and the Horus Heresy reduced humanity's technological capacity, produced machines and systems and databases of knowledge that the Imperium of the 41st millennium genuinely cannot match or recreate. A functioning STC, a standard template construct, on one of those ancient artificial intelligences that contain the sum total of human technological knowledge from the height of the Dark Age, found aboard a long-displaced vessel, would be among the most valuable objects in the galaxy, potentially civilization-altering, potentially capable of giving the Imperium capabilities it has not possessed in 10,000 years. This is why the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperium's faction of tech priests and machine worshippers who form the backbone of imperial industry and military technology, is always among the first to respond when a long-displaced vessel emerges. They are not there for the crew. They are there for what the ship might be carrying. Part 9. The Imperial Response, Inquisition, Adeptus Mechanicus, and the Politics of Impossible Survivors. The moment a long-displaced ship is confirmed as having emerged from the warp significantly out of time, the machinery of the Imperium begins to move with a speed and urgency that might seem surprising given that the Imperium is often not associated with rapid response. But certain triggers in the imperial administrative apparatus are designed to cut through the usual bureaucratic inertia, and the emergence of a vessel from a time period that predates the current era by centuries or millennia is absolutely one of those triggers. The first institution to act is typically the Imperial Navy's local command structure. Standard protocol upon detecting an unknown vessel emerging from the warp involves challenge and identification, followed by a preliminary assessment of the vessel's status. Or when a vessel's identification codes match a historical record rather than a current registry, when the ship's registration number is in the database, but the database entry is marked as lost in transit and dated to a period that could be decades, centuries, or millennia in the past. This triggers an elevated alert status and initiates a communication chain that moves rapidly up the command hierarchy. The Navy's immediate concern is practical and military. A ship emerging from the warp in an unexpected temporal location is, until proven otherwise, a potential threat. A ship whose crew may have been exposed to warp entities, chaos corruption, or demonic infestation for an extended subjective period is a potential vector for all of those things to spread into real space. The Navy's response is containment. The emerging vessel is challenged, ordered to heave to and maintain position, and surrounded by whatever picket forces are available, while the higher levels of the chain of command are notified. The second institution to be notified is the Inquisition, in particular, at the Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition tasked with dealing with demonic threats, and the Ordo Hereticus, the branch tasked with dealing with threats to the purity of the imperial cult and the integrity of imperial society. Both have standing interest in vessels that have undergone extended warp displacement. An inquisitor with appropriate authority will typically be on site within hours or days, depending on the local availability of inquisitorial assets. What the inquisitor's priorities are in order: determining whether the vessel carries any demonic infestation, determining whether any crew members have been corrupted or compromised, determining whether the vessel carries any technology or information that poses a security risk, and determining what to do about the crew's knowledge. That last point is the delicate one. It is the one that, in the most extreme cases, can result in outcomes that are deeply uncomfortable to contemplate. Shot the crew of a ship that departed during the Great Crusade and has returned in the 41st millennium. carries first-hand memories and direct testimony from a period of history that the current Imperium has every institutional reason to control very carefully. They remember things that the official imperial historical record has distorted, suppressed, or reframed. They remember an emperor who was a living man rather than a god. They remember primarchs who were complex, of flawed human-adjacent figures rather than the divine personages their mythologized forms have become. They remember a time when the official imperial religion did not exist, when the emperor himself explicitly rejected the idea of being worshipped as a god, which would be, if widely circulated, deeply destabilizing to the ecclesiarchy's entire theological foundation. The Inquisition understands this. The Inquisition is, among other things, an institution whose core function is managing information about the true nature of the warp, the true history of the Imperium, and the true state of the ongoing threat against humanity in ways that prevent the general population from losing its collective mind. This is not always done through crude suppression, though crude suppression is certainly in the toolkit. It is done through quarantine, through careful debriefing, and through the classification of testimony at the highest clearance levels, and through the reassignment of crew members to positions where their knowledge will be useful rather than socially disruptive. A crew returning from 10,000 years in the warp will, in many practical scenarios, be treated well. They are potentially extraordinarily valuable, as their first-hand accounts of the 30th millennium are living history that even the most dedicated scholars of the Logos Historica Verita, that small institution established by Robute Guilliman in the early 42nd millennium to actually attempt an honest accounting of imperial history, cannot recreate from documents alone. Their memories of technology, of political structures, of the actual mechanics of the Great Crusade's operations, are primary sources from an era when primary sources are vanishingly rare. But treated well and allowed to live freely are not necessarily the same thing. In the Imperium of the 41st millennium, individuals who know too much or who know the wrong things frequently find their lives arranged for them by the Inquisition rather than arranged by themselves. There is also the Adeptus Mechanicus dimension to this response. The tech priests will want access to the ship's databanks. They will want to examine its technology. If the ship dates from the Dark Age of technology, that era from the 15th to the 25th millennium, that produced technology that the Imperium cannot currently replicate, then the tech priests will want everything. Every circuit, every blueprint, every scrap of stored information in every memory core. If the ship carries an STC fragment, a working STC database, or even just manufacturing specifications for technologies that have been lost to the Imperium, as the Adeptus Mechanicus will mobilize assets to secure and study those materials on a priority level that competes with ongoing military campaigns. The relationship between the Inquisition's interest in the crew and the Mechanicus's interest in the ship can create significant political friction. Inquisitors outrank tech priests in most legal frameworks within the Imperium, but the Adeptus Mechanicus has its own charter, its own semi-independent sovereignty, and its own methods of ensuring that things it considers important remain in its custody. The arrival of a long-displaced vessel can trigger a quiet institutional conflict between the black-robed servants of the Emperor's law and the red-robed servants of the Omnissiah's will that is resolved differently depending on the specific political power balances in that sector of space. And then there is the question of the civilian infrastructure, because the crew are, after all, not all members of some military or semi-military organization. The merchant freighter's crew of 1,200 includes civilians, families, people with no formal imperial service record who simply work on ships because they were born there or because it was how they found employment. These people have legal standing, financial records, family connections. If the ship has been gone for 10,000 years, those connections are obviously severed beyond any possibility of recovery. But the records still exist. The ship still has a legal registry, even a 10,000-year-old one. The cargo in the hold, if any remains, technically still belongs to whoever contracted for it. And tracing that ownership chain across 10 millennia of political change and institutional evolution is a problem that several minor administratum offices will spend the next 100 years very slowly not solving. The Imperium, for all its flaws, is a bureaucracy of extraordinary depth and longevity. And bureaucracies have a particular way of responding to the impossible. They generate paperwork. The arrival of a ship from 10,000 years ago produces, within the imperial administrative system, a truly remarkable quantity of paperwork, most of it incomprehensible to any individual office, because each office only sees the piece of the problem relevant to its jurisdiction, and no office has the jurisdiction to see the whole. As Part 10, Real Law Examples, Ships Lost and Ships Returned. We have been speaking largely in hypotheticals, but the lore of Warhammer 40,000 gives us real examples. Canonical ships and vessels whose fates illuminate the principles we've been discussing. Let us walk through some of the most significant ones, because they are the proof that this is not theoretical. Perhaps the single most extraordinary case in the official lore of a ship experiencing extreme temporal displacement while carrying the full weight of historical significance is the Spirit of Eternity. This was a Dark Age of technology vessel, a ship from the 24th millennium, the height of humanity's technological achievement, roughly 300 meters long, carrying aboard it an STC data core, which means it was effectively carrying a significant portion of humanity's entire technological knowledge base at the time. Its sister ship was the Blade of Infinity. In the 24th millennium, the Spirit of Eternity began a journey into the warp and was caught in a warp storm so severe that the ship was not merely displaced, but essentially catapulted through time on a scale that defies easy comprehension. The ship witnessed, according to accounts preserved in the lore, the formation of the galaxy itself and the eventual future destruction of the universe by chaos, which is to say, the temporal displacement it experienced was so extreme, it moved the vessel not just forward or backward in time, but through the entirety of time, from beginning to end. Whether this is meant literally or metaphorically in the source material is somewhat ambiguous. But either interpretation speaks to the absolute extremity of what the warp can do to time when conditions are sufficiently catastrophic. The Spirit of Eternity eventually re-emerged into the galaxy at some point after the Horus Heresy. In other words, after the 31st millennium. Its captain, carrying a crew that had apparently survived this impossible voyage, made the decision to rendezvous with a nearby human-inhabited planet, but believing that making contact with human civilization was the appropriate course of action. What happened next is one of the most grimly instructive moments in all of 40,000 lore. The captain and crew were captured by the inhabitants of the planet, tortured and murdered. Not because the planet's inhabitants were particularly evil, but because humanity, in the post-heresy era, in the early millennia of the Imperium stabilization, was deeply and comprehensively traumatized by the age of strife that had preceded the Emperor's reunification and by the Horus Heresy itself. A strange vessel with strange technology appearing from nowhere, with a crew speaking in archaic dialects and claiming to have come from the Dark Age of technology, was not greeted as a miracle. It was greeted as something suspicious, possibly dangerous, possibly heretical. The locals defaulted to the safest option available to them: eliminate the unknown. The ship's AI, because the Spirit of Eternity, being a Dark Age of technology vessel, possessed one of those human-level artificial intelligences that the Imperium has since banned as the Men of Iron that once turned against their creators, witnessed the murder of the crew it had protected through the entirety of that impossible voyage. As this event shaped its subsequent behavior in ways that made it extremely dangerous. The AI developed a profound and justified hatred of humanity, combined with an intense desire to escape the galaxy entirely. It fled, spending centuries wandering the void. Eventually, the Spirit of Eternity became entangled within the Space Hulk, known as the Death of Integrity, the same Hulk that, in 887 of the 39th millennium, But the blood drinkers and Nova Marines would board in search of Genestealer infestations and find instead an extraordinarily well-preserved STC database. That STC was, presumably, the data core the Spirit of Eternity had been carrying since the 24th millennium, passed through centuries of temporal displacement. And one of the great ironies in 40k history, the crew that carried it was murdered for their trouble. And the technology they carried was eventually recovered by the descendants of the civilization that murdered them. Another rich vein of examples comes from the phenomenon of the Legion of the Damned, which is where mythology and lore merge in ways that are appropriately difficult to untangle. What's the most commonly cited origin theory for the Legion of the Damned? Those ghost flame space marines who appear inexplicably on battlefields where the Imperium faces hopeless odds and vanish just as inexplicably once their work is done, is that they are the remnants of the Firehawk Space Marine chapter. In 963 of the 41st millennium, the entire Firehawks chapter fleet, including their fortress monastery ship, the Raptorus Rex, attempted a warp transit to the Crow's World subsector and vanished completely. After 20 years, the Imperium declared them lost and began the formal process of memorializing them as a chapter destroyed in service. The earlier, more explicit version of this story, from Rick Priestley's original 1988 White Dwarf article, identified the Firehawks as the Legion of the Damned explicitly, the survivors of the lost fleet, are afflicted with a warp-borne wasting disease that is slowly consuming them, but has also heightened their strength and removed their vulnerability to fear, continue to fight for the Imperium from within, whatever temporal pocket the warp has consigned them to, appearing in real space briefly to intervene in critical battles, and then disappearing back into the immaterium. They are neither truly lost nor truly present. They exist in a state of ongoing temporal displacement, or emerging to act and then retreating, their subjective time disconnected from the Imperium's timeline in a way that allows them to appear across centuries of real space history while experiencing a continuous, if horrific, existence. The more recent lore treats the Legion of the Damned with more deliberate mysticism, not confirming or denying the Firehawks' connection, allowing the mystery to remain mysterious. But the underlying concept, a force of space marines lost in the warp, and experiencing a kind of extended temporal displacement that allows them to appear anachronistically across centuries of history, is canonically supported. There is also the broader phenomenon of the Abyssal Crusade, which sent a large number of Space Marine chapters into the Eye of Terror in 127 of the 37th millennium, and lost most of them to chaos corruption or simply to disappearance. Some of those lost chapters may still be out there in some sense, traveling through temporal spaces within the Eye that don't sync cleanly with the external universe, experiencing subjective time on a schedule that has no necessary relationship with the millennia that have passed outside. The Eye of Terror, as a permanent region of space where the warp presses directly against reality, has its own extreme temporal distortions that make the standard warp displacement look almost tame by comparison. Notably, the phenomenon of ships returning from extended warp displacement with technology from lost eras is one of the primary drivers of technological recovery in the Imperium. The STC databases, recovered from various space hulks and from rare surviving vessels from the dark age of technology, represent almost the entirety of the meaningful technological advances the Imperium has managed in the last several thousand years. And this is one of the more quietly devastating details of the 40,000 setting. The Imperium's technology is not advancing. It is recovering, slowly and incompletely, from a level it achieved and then lost. Every meaningful weapon design, every functioning starship class, every standard pattern of power armor has its roots in templates and designs from thousands of years ago. The Imperium is rebuilding from the ruins of its own golden age, and the rebuilding is going badly. And the only significant sources of genuine advancement are the accidental time capsules delivered by ships lost and then returned by the warp. The galaxy's most advanced civilization, for practical purposes, is receiving its technological gifts from ships that got lost. There is something deeply appropriate about this in the context of the 40,000 universe's fundamental themes. The Imperium does not build forward, it recovers backward. It does not create the future, it excavates the past. At Part 11, the psychological ruins, what survival does to the mind. Let us come back to the crew one final time, because the lore of what happens to the people who survive these voyages, who come through the warp and emerge 10,000 years out of place and then have to continue living, is one of the most psychologically rich corners of 40,000 that doesn't get enough attention. There is a specific kind of grief that has no clean name. Grief for what you have lost is a known quantity. Grief for what has been taken from you, for people you have outlived, for relationships severed by death. These are recognized experiences with recognized names and recognized cultural frameworks for processing them. But the grief of a temporal displacement survivor is different. They have not outlived the people they left behind. They have been cut off from a timeline, removed from a moment in history, while time continued without them. The people they knew are not dead in the ordinary sense, as they died thousands of years ago. Everyone they knew, everyone they loved, everyone they hated, every enemy, every friend, every person who owed them money or who they owed a favor to, all of them have been dust for longer than written history goes in our own timeline. The crew of the returned ship did not attend these deaths. They did not get to say goodbye. They did not get to watch the people they loved grow old, or to be there for the moments that mattered, or to grieve in real time. In us, they simply arrived in a future where those people are so long gone that no record of them exists as a living thing. The best a crew member might find, if they search the archives, is a name in a genealogical record, a date, a small entry in some administrative database that has survived by accident rather than by design, noting that a person with that name lived during that period and performed some recorded function. The people themselves, their personalities, their voices, their specific gravity in the life of the crew member who misses them, are gone completely. This is compounded by the particular character of what the crew has returned to. They are not returning to a world that is recognizably different in gentle evolutionary ways. They are returning to a world that has undergone at least one catastrophic civilizational upheaval and 10,000 years of ongoing crisis. The Horus heresy, if they departed before it, is not merely historical context. For a crew member who knew the legiones Astartes of the Great Crusade personally, who perhaps worked alongside a Space Marine Legion, or ferried supplies for the Great Crusade, or was stationed on a world that a Primarch visited, the knowledge of what happened during the heresy, what happened to those magnificent and terrible beings they knew, is a specific and personal grief layered on top of the general displacement. The Emperor is on his throne, a crew member who last saw the Emperor as a living presence, or who at least lived in a time when he walked the galaxy in some meaningful sense, returns to find that this being, this focal point of Imperial civilization, has been a corpse that won't die for 10,000 years. The emotional weight of this depends enormously on the individual and their relationship to the Emperor's mythology. For deeply faithful crew members, it might deepen their faith. He endures, even in this terrible form, which is itself a kind of miracle. For less faithful or more philosophically minded crew members, the revelation might be shattering. For those who knew the Emperor as a living man and not as a god, the discovery that he has been made into a god precisely because he can no longer be anything else is one of the more horrifying historical truths they will have to process. The psychological support structures available to these crew members are not designed for their situation. The Imperial cult's pastoral care is, frankly, not equipped to counsel someone through 10,000-year temporal displacement. The medical staff aboard the returning ship, if they are still functional, have access to the same resources they had when they left, resources from a time 10,000 years prior. The psychological literature of the 30th millennium is not the same as the psychological literature of the 41st, and even if it were, the specific grief of temporal displacement is not something that any human civilization has had to address at sufficient scale to produce comprehensive guidance. What typically happens, based on the scattered accounts in the lore and on the logic of human psychology under extreme stress, is a kind of compartmentalization that allows function while delaying full processing. The crew continues to perform their roles. They eat and sleep and do their jobs and have conversations that are on the surface, relatively normal. The deeper grief, the full weight of what has been lost, of the strangeness of the world they have returned to, of the impossibility of their own position in history, gets processed slowly, imperfectly, over a period of years, and for some crew members, never fully resolved. The old voidfarer wisdom, developed over generations of living slightly out of time with the rest of humanity, applies here. You adapt or you break. And the ones who adapt are the ones who can find meaning in the present, even when the past is gone. There is also the specific psychological pressure of being historically significant in ways the crew did not choose. The Inquisition wants their testimony. The Adeptus Mechanicus wants their technology. Scholars want their first-hand accounts. Everyone who interacts with them is processing them as historical objects rather than as people. Mas and the crew members are aware of this dynamic in ways that are quietly corrosive to their sense of self. You are not a person to the 41st millennium. You are a document. Some crew members respond to this by leaning into the historical role. They become curators of their own memories, carefully recording everything they can remember about the world they came from, producing testimonies and memoirs and detailed accounts that they know will be classified above most clearance levels as soon as the Inquisition processes them, but that feel important to write down anyway because the act of writing them is a form of insisting that they were real, that the world they came from was real, that the people in it were real people and not merely historical figures. Others respond by refusing the historical role entirely. They decline to give testimony beyond what is legally required. They do not cooperate with scholarly inquiries. They insist on being treated as ordinary citizens with ordinary futures, rather than as artifacts of a dead past. This approach has its own costs. It puts them in conflict with institutions that are not accustomed to being refused, but it preserves something. And some break. Some cannot hold the weight. Some look at what they have returned to, the cold, authoritarian, be it religiously extreme, perpetually besieged Imperium of the 41st millennium, with all of its grinding horror and its institutional cruelty and its billions of lives consumed by endless war, and compare it to whatever version of imperial civilization they left 10,000 years ago, and find the comparison too painful to bear. The galaxy they came from was not utopia. The early Imperium had its own brutalities, its own injustices, its own darkness, but it had hope in it. Yes, it had the possibility of something better. The 41st millennium has processed that hope through 10,000 years of war and paranoia and religious extremism, and come out on the other side with very little of it remaining. The returning crew sees the arc. They see the distance between what was and what is, and they are living evidence of how far things have fallen. Part 12. Closing meditation. The warp keeps its secrets, but releases its proof. There is a reason this topic resonates so deeply with people who spend time thinking about the 40,000 universe. It is not just the spectacle of it, though the spectacle is extraordinary. The image of a ship from another age emerging into the 41st millennium is visually and narratively compelling in ways that practically write themselves. It is the philosophical density of it, not the way it forces you to sit with questions that the setting is always gesturing toward, but rarely states directly. Warhammer 40,000 is, at its core, a setting about what happens when a civilization loses the plot. It is a meditation on the relationship between institutional memory and institutional purpose, on the cost of trauma and the way trauma reshapes the societies that carry it. On the specific horror of a civilization that knows it is failing but cannot stop failing because the mechanisms it would need to change have themselves been captured by the failure. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is not evil in the sense of having decided to be evil. It is a system that began with genuine idealism and has spent 10,000 years being ground down by the weight of what it has to survive, until the idealism is no longer recognizable in the outcome. On a ship returning from 10,000 years in the warp is the Imperium's own past, arriving at its door like a ghost. It is a direct confrontation with the distance between what was and what is. It is evidence that things were different once, that the darkness the 41st millennium treats as simply the natural state of the universe was once genuinely not there, that the Emperor's dream, however imperfect and however costly, was once a thing in motion rather than a thing entombed. And the Imperium's response to this confrontation, the Inquisition quarantining the crew, the Adeptus Mechanicus cataloguing the technology, the Church ensuring the historical record is not disrupted too severely, is itself the story. The returning ship does not change the 41st millennium. It is absorbed by the 41st millennium, processed, classified, and integrated into the machinery of an institution that has been doing this kind of thing for 10,000 years and has become very good at making sure that things which challenge the official narrative do not get to do so publicly. But nothing is ever perfectly absorbed. The testimony gets out. The technology gets used. Some crew member tells some scholar what they remember, and the scholar tells some other scholar, and eventually the ripple of a world that existed 10,000 years ago reaches someone who hasn't yet been made entirely incapable of being surprised. The warp, for all the horror it causes, it is also, in some strange sense, the only part of the 41st millennium's universe that does not maintain the official story. The warp is chaos and cruelty and predatory madness, yes, but it is also honest. It brings things forward from the past without checking whether the destination wants.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.